January 3, 2026. Just 2 days ago, U.S. military strikes hit Venezuela's capital, Caracas. Fighter jets, warships, special forces. Operation Absolute Resolve. Within hours, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro was captured and transported to a U.S. warship. The White House announced it. Donald Trump told Fox News the U.S. would be very strongly involved in Venezuela's oil industry moving forward. Wait, what? The U.S. just invaded a sovereign country, captured its president, and openly said they're taking control of its oil. In 2026, this isn't some declassified Cold War operation. This literally happened 48 hours ago. And the craziest part, this has been building for over 100 years. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq, more than anyone. And for over a century, the U.S. has been trying to control it, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through coups, sometimes through sanctions, and now, direct military invasion. But here's what nobody's talking about. This isn't just about oil. It's about a century-long battle between capitalism and socialism, between U.S. corporate interests and Latin American sovereignty, between empires and revolutions. It's about Hugo Chavez daring to nationalize his country's oil in the 2000s, and the U.S. never forgiving him for it. It's about decades of coup attempts, economic warfare, and propaganda campaigns that finally culminated in what we just witnessed. So let's break it down. Why does the U.S. always target Venezuela? What's the real history? And what the hell just happened 2 days ago? Drop a comment with your thoughts on this situation and hit subscribe for more geopolitical breakdowns. To understand why the U.S. just invaded Venezuela 2 days ago, we need to go back exactly 100 years. Because this story starts with oil. A lot of oil. More oil than anyone expected. In 1922, a well called Barroso No. 2 in Cabimas, Venezuela blew out. Oil shot into the sky. It was massive, and it changed everything. Venezuela went from being a relatively poor agricultural country to becoming one of the world's biggest oil exporters almost overnight. By 1928, just 6 years later, Venezuela was the world's leading oil exporter. Not Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. Here's the thing about that oil though, it wasn't Venezuelans who were drilling it. It was foreign companies, mostly American, Royal Dutch Shell, Standard Oil, Gulf Oil. These weren't Venezuelan companies setting up operations. These were massive Western oil corporations that rushed in, bought up land, negotiated favorable deals with Venezuela's government, and started extracting billions of dollars worth of oil. And the Venezuelan government at the time, they didn't mind. Or more accurately, the military strongmen running Venezuela, guys like Juan Vicente Gomez, didn't mind as long as they got their cut. By the 1930s, 3 foreign companies controlled about 98% of Venezuela's oil production. One was British Dutch, the other 2, American, predecessors of what would later become Chevron and ExxonMobil. Venezuela became the second largest oil producer in the world by the 1930s, right behind the United States. Oil revenues exploded. The country got rich, but here's the problem. Most of that wealth was flowing out of the country into the pockets of foreign corporations and the Venezuelan elite. The average Venezuelan wasn't seeing much of it. Fast forward to the 1940s. President Isaías Medina Angarita tries to reform the oil sector. He raises taxes on foreign companies, renegotiates contracts to give Venezuela a bigger share of the profits. It's not nationalization, he's not kicking the companies out, but it's a move toward more control. And the U.S., they don't actively oppose him, but they don't support him either. In 1945, he's overthrown in a military coup. The U.S. doesn't intervene to stop it. This sets a pattern. For decades, Venezuela's oil wealth is controlled by a small elite and foreign corporations. The country is stable enough to keep production high, but politically chaotic enough that no strong nationalist movement can take full control. The US likes it this way. Oil is flowing, profits are high. American companies have access to one of the world's largest reserves. By 1960, Venezuela becomes a founding member of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, alongside Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. The goal: coordinate oil prices and give oil-producing nations more control over their own resources. This is the beginning of Venezuela trying to assert more control over its oil, but it's still operating within a system dominated by Western oil companies. Then comes 1976. Everything changes. President Carlos Andrés Pérez officially nationalizes Venezuela's oil industry on January 1, 1976. The government takes control. They create PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, the state-owned oil company. Foreign companies like ExxonMobil, Gulf Oil, and Mobil, which had invested over $5 billion in Venezuela, are told their days of full control are over. Venezuela now owns its oil. This is a massive deal. Venezuela was the chief supplier of foreign oil to the US, the largest and most sophisticated petroleum complex in Latin America, and now it's state-owned. The US isn't happy about it, but at this point, Venezuela is still willing to work with American companies through service contracts and partnerships. PDVSA becomes one of the most respected national oil companies in the world. Production stays high. Venezuela remains a reliable supplier to the US, sending 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day to American refineries in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But nationalization planted a seed. It showed that Venezuela could control its own resources. And when Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, that seed grew into a full-blown revolution. Hugo Chavez was not what the US expected. A former army officer who led a failed coup attempt in 1992, Chavez rose to national fame by positioning himself as a champion of the poor. In 1998, he ran for president on a socialist platform, promising to use Venezuela's vast oil wealth to reduce poverty and inequality. And he won. The US wasn't immediately hostile. At first, Chavez seemed like he might work within the system. But by the early 2000s, it became clear that Chavez had bigger plans. He launched what he called the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simón Bolívar, the South American independence hero. The goal: redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth to the people, break free from US influence, and create a socialist state. Here's where things got tense. In 2001 to 2002, Chavez started making moves that terrified the US and the Venezuelan elite. He increased government control over the oil industry. He raised royalties that foreign oil companies had to pay. He started providing subsidized oil to Cuba and other left-wing governments in Latin America through an alliance called Petrocarra. And he began talking about reducing exports to the United States. The Venezuelan opposition, business elites, media moguls, and right-wing politicians freaked out. So did the US government. And in April 2002, they tried to get rid of him. On April 11, 2002, a coup was launched against Chavez. It was led by Venezuelan military officers and business leaders, with heavy support from the US. Chavez was arrested and removed from power. Pedro Carmona, a business executive, declared himself president. The Bush administration immediately recognized the new government. It looked like a done deal, except it wasn't. Within 48 hours, massive protests erupted in Caracas. Millions of Venezuelans, mostly poor, mostly supporters of Chavez, took to the streets demanding his return. The military, seeing the backlash, reversed course. Chavez was brought back to power. The coup failed. And here's the key part. Evidence later surfaced that the US had prior knowledge of the coup and may have actively supported it. The CIA met with coup plotters in the weeks before the attempt. The US funded National Endowment for Democracy, had been financing opposition groups in Venezuela. When the coup collapsed, the U.S. tried to distance itself, but the damage was done. Chávez now had proof, at least in his mind and in the minds of his supporters, that the U.S. wanted him gone. After surviving the coup, Chávez doubled down. In 2002 to 2003, workers at PDVSA, many of them opposed to Chávez, went on strike, trying to cripple the oil industry and force him out. The strike failed. Chávez fired 18,000 PDVSA workers, gutting the company of technical expertise, but also purging it of opposition. From that point on, PDVSA was loyal to Chávez. Then, in 2006 to 2007, Chávez went even further. He ordered all foreign oil companies operating in Venezuela to convert their projects into joint ventures, where PDVSA would hold at least 60% ownership. In other words, if you want to operate here, Venezuela controls the majority stake. Some companies accepted. Chevron, for example, renegotiated and stayed. But ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips refused. They weren't about to give up majority control, so Chávez nationalized their assets. ExxonMobil was kicked out of Venezuela in 2007. ConocoPhillips followed. Both companies later won international arbitration cases against Venezuela, but they never got their assets back. They were gone. Chávez also started selling more oil to China, Russia, and other non-Western countries. He was deliberately reducing Venezuela's dependence on the U.S. market. By the mid-2000s, Venezuela was no longer just an oil supplier. It was a geopolitical challenge. Chávez was openly anti-American, calling President George W. Bush the devil in a UN speech. He was forming alliances with Cuba, Iran, and Russia. He was funding left-wing movements across Latin America and the U.S. They couldn't do much about it. Chávez was democratically elected. He had massive popular support, and he controlled the oil. Any direct military intervention would have been a disaster, so the U.S. waited. And when Chávez died of cancer in 2013, they hoped Venezuela would change course. It didn't. Nicolás Maduro, Chávez's hand-picked successor, took over. And that's when things got really ugly. Nicolás Maduro inherited a country in trouble. Chávez's policies, while reducing poverty in the short term, had gutted Venezuela's economy. PDVSA was mismanaged. Oil production was declining. Government debt was skyrocketing. And by the mid-2010s, Venezuela was in full economic collapse. But here's the thing. A lot of that collapse was made worse by U.S. policy. Starting in 2014, the U.S. began imposing sanctions on Venezuela. At first, they were targeted, specific individuals in Maduro's government. But over time, they expanded into full-blown economic warfare. In 2017, the Trump administration banned U.S. entities from dealing with new Venezuelan debt. In 2019, they sanctioned PDVSA directly, cutting off Venezuela's access to the U.S. oil market. They froze Venezuelan government assets held in U.S. banks, billions of dollars. They sanctioned Venezuela's gold exports. They made it nearly impossible for Venezuela to sell its oil anywhere, cutting off its main source of revenue. The stated goal: pressure Maduro to step down. The U.S. argued that Maduro was a dictator, that he had rigged elections, that he was starving his own people. And to be fair, Maduro's government was authoritarian. There were credible reports of human rights abuses, rigged elections, and corruption. But the sanctions didn't just hurt Maduro. They hurt ordinary Venezuelans. Hyperinflation hit 1,000,000% at one point. Basic goods like food and medicine became scarce. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country, and the U.S. kept pushing. In 2019, they recognized Juan Guaido, the opposition leader, as Venezuela's interim president. Guaido had never won a presidential election. He was the head of the National Assembly, and he declared himself president based on a constitutional clause. The U.S. backed him immediately. So did the UK, Canada, and most of the European Union. Suddenly, there were two presidents of Venezuela: Maduro, who controlled the government and military, and Guaido, who the US said was the legitimate leader. This was regime change 101, the playbook the US has used in Iran, Chile, Nicaragua, and dozens of other countries. Back an opposition figure, impose sanctions to destabilize the economy, fund opposition groups, apply international pressure, wait for the government to collapse. Except Maduro didn't collapse. The military stayed loyal. Guaido's support faded. By 2020 to 2021, even countries that had recognized him started backing away. The coup attempt, because that's what it was, failed. But the US didn't give up. In 2023, they briefly eased some sanctions after Maduro agreed to hold elections. But when those elections didn't meet US standards, the sanctions came back. In March 2025, the Trump administration revoked Chevron's license to operate in Venezuela, cutting off one of the last remaining ties between the two countries' oil industries. And then in December 2025, Trump went even further. He announced a total and complete blockade of Venezuela. US warships surrounded the country. They intercepted ships entering and leaving Venezuelan ports. Trump claimed they were stopping drug trafficking, but he provided no evidence. It was clear this was about oil and regime change. Venezuela's oil production, which had once been over 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s, had collapsed to around 700,000 to 800,000 barrels per day by late 2025. The country was in ruins, and the US was tightening the noose. Then came January 3, 2026. January 3, 2026, 2 days ago, the US launched Operation Absolute Resolve, a large-scale military operation targeting Venezuela. Fighter jets struck military installations in and around Caracas. US Special Forces entered the city. Within hours, President Nicolás Maduro was captured and transported to the USS Iwo Jima, a warship off the coast of Venezuela. Let that sink in. The United States invaded a sovereign country, captured its president, and is now holding him on a US military vessel. And it's not even being hidden. Trump went on Fox News the next day and openly said the US would be very strongly involved in Venezuela's oil industry. Stephen Miller, Trump's Homeland Security advisor, went even further, suggesting that Venezuela's oil belongs to the US. This isn't a covert operation. This isn't a CIA coup where they deny involvement. This is open, brazen military intervention. And the justification: Trump claims Venezuela is a failed state, that Maduro is a dictator, that the US is liberating the Venezuelan people. But let's be real. This is about oil. Venezuela has 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's 17% of the world's total, more than Saudi Arabia, more than any other country on earth. And right now, Venezuela's oil production is at a fraction of its capacity. If the US can install a friendly government, lift sanctions, and bring in American oil companies, they could potentially unlock one of the largest oil supplies on the planet. Trump has been very clear about this. In interviews, he's talked about how Venezuela stole US companies' assets when Chavez nationalized the industry. He's framed this as reclaiming what's rightfully America's. And now that Maduro is in US custody, the path is clear to install a new government. The question is, who? The US is reportedly backing Maria Corina Machado, a right-wing opposition leader who has long been critical of Maduro and supportive of US intervention. If she takes power, you can bet the first thing she'll do is invite American oil companies back in. But here's the problem. This isn't 1973, when the US could orchestrate a coup in Chile and get away with it. The international backlash has been immediate and severe. Russia called the strikes an act of armed aggression. China said they were deeply shocked. Mexico condemned the invasion as a violation of the UN Charter. Even some U.S. allies in Europe are expressing concern. And there's the question of what happens next. Does the U.S. stay in Venezuela? Do they try to rebuild the country's oil industry? Do they install a puppet government and hope it holds? History suggests this won't go smoothly. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Every time the U.S. has tried to force regime change through military intervention, it's ended in chaos. But Trump doesn't seem concerned about that. He's focused on the oil. And right now, with Maduro captured and U.S. forces in control of key infrastructure, he has it. So why does the U.S. always target Venezuela? Let's break it down into three parts: oil, ideology, and empire. Oil. This is the obvious one. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. For over 100 years, American companies have been involved in extracting that oil. When Chavez and Maduro nationalized the industry and kicked out ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, they cost U.S. corporations billions. Trump himself has framed this as Venezuela stealing U.S. assets. The goal now is to reclaim that oil, bring in American companies, and turn Venezuela back into a reliable oil supplier for the U.S. Ideology. Venezuela under Chavez became a symbol of 21st century socialism. Chavez used oil wealth to fund social programs, reduce poverty, and challenge U.S. hegemony in Latin America. He allied with Cuba, supported left-wing movements across the continent, and openly criticized U.S. imperialism. For the U.S., especially conservative, pro-capitalist administrations, Venezuela became an ideological threat. If socialism could succeed in Venezuela, it might spread. So they had to make sure it failed. Empire. The U.S. has long viewed Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, established in 1823, essentially declared that the Western Hemisphere was under U.S. influence. Any country that challenges that influence, whether it's Cuba in the 1960s or Venezuela in the 2000s, becomes a target. Venezuela's alliances with Russia, China, and Iran were seen as unacceptable. A country in the US's sphere of influence cannot align with U.S. adversaries. So they had to bring Venezuela back in line. Put it all together, and you get 100 years of tension, coups, sanctions, and now open military invasion. Venezuela's story is the story of what happens when a country tries to control its own resources and chart its own path in a world where the U.S. expects compliance. And now, with Maduro captured and U.S. forces in Venezuela, we're watching the culmination of a century-long conflict. The question is, what happens next? Does Venezuela become a U.S.-friendly oil exporter again? Or does this spiral into a prolonged occupation that destabilizes the entire region? We'll find out soon enough. But one thing is clear. The U.S. has always targeted Venezuela, and they finally got what they wanted. So that's the full story of why the U.S. always targets Venezuela. It's not just about what happened 2 days ago. It's about 100 years of oil, power, and ideology clashing in one of the most resource-rich countries on Earth. We started in the 1920s when foreign oil companies, mostly American, rushed into Venezuela and turned it into the world's leading oil exporter. We saw how, for decades, those companies extracted billions while the average Venezuelan saw little benefit. Then came 1976, when Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and took back control. For a while that worked. Venezuela and the U.S. coexisted. Oil flowed. Everyone made money. But then Hugo Chavez showed up in 1999 with a socialist revolution, and everything changed. Chavez didn't just want Venezuela to control its oil. He wanted to use that oil to challenge U.S. power in Latin America. He formed alliances with Cuba, Russia, and China. He kicked out ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. He provided subsidized oil to left-wing governments, and he openly called the U.S. an imperialist power. The U.S. responded with a coup attempt in 2002. It failed, so they tried sanctions. Decade after decade of economic warfare designed to collapse Venezuela's economy and force Maduro, Chávez's successor, out of power. And when that didn't work fast enough, they invaded. January 3, 2026, Operation Absolute Resolve. U.S. forces captured Nicolás Maduro and took control of key infrastructure. Trump went on TV and said the U.S. would be very strongly involved in Venezuela's oil industry. Stephen Miller said Venezuela's oil belongs to the U.S. This isn't subtle. This is open imperialism. And the crazy part, this is exactly what Chávez warned about. For years, he said the U.S. would never accept Venezuela controlling its own oil. He said they'd try to overthrow him, destabilize the country, and eventually invade. And he was right. The question now is, what happens next? Does the U.S. install a friendly government and rebuild Venezuela's oil industry? Or does this turn into another Iraq, a prolonged occupation that costs trillions and destabilizes an entire region? History suggests it won't be smooth. Forced regime change rarely works. Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of them were supposed to be quick operations that would bring stability and democracy. Instead, they brought chaos, civil war, and decades of suffering. But the U.S. doesn't seem to care. Because at the end of the day, this has always been about one thing: control. Control of oil, control of Latin America, control of the global order. Venezuela tried to break free from that control, and for 25 years they succeeded. But empires don't give up easily. And now, with Maduro in U.S. custody and American forces on Venezuelan soil, the empire has reasserted itself. The story of U.S.-Venezuela relations is a story about power, about what happens when a country tries to stand up to the world's most powerful military and economic force, and about how, in the end, oil and empire always win, at least in the short term. Whether that lasts, that's the question we'll be answering in the months and years to come. If this video opened your eyes to what's really happening in Venezuela, drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. Do you think the U.S. was justified in invading? Or is this straight-up imperialism? I want to hear from you. And if you learned something you didn't know before, if you had no idea about the 2002 coup, or the oil nationalization, or the 100 years of tension, share this video. Because mainstream media isn't telling this full story. They're framing it as U.S. liberates Venezuela from dictator. But the real story is way more complicated than that. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives into geopolitics, history, and the stories that don't make it into the headlines. This channel is about understanding the world as it actually is, not as governments want you to see it. Thanks for watching. And remember, when someone tells you a conflict is simple, it's usually because they're hiding the complexity. See you in the next one.